Well, I'm glad to be with you. I am to speak tonight on the subject of education in an hour, teaching life's most crucial most crucial lesson in one sitting. I'm going to try and do it in 40 minutes and beat my previous record. So we'll see if that is possible. But I actually gave the talk this title because I want to try and force a moment of psychic dissonance on you. I want you to think, as I say, I am going to explain the idea of education in an hour in 40 minutes. I want you to respond to that by going, what? That is clearly impossible. And because you have that reaction, what I'd like you to do is think for a minute about what you mean by the terms education and an hour, and what your assumptions are about education and about how it's accomplished, and indeed about what it actually is. Because if we spend so much of our time and energy and effort aiming at something that we haven't really taken a minute to define and understand for ourselves, we run the risk of spending our energy unwisely. We run the risk of wasting our time. And as homeschoolers, we know that we can't afford to do that. There's too little of it to go around. So as full-time educators of your own children who have taken on such a great burden in such a noble calling, against all kinds of opposition, not just from the society around you, but maybe from your own family, from your own people, against limitations of time and resources and training and experience and confidence, you have said to all of those forces arrayed against you, I'm going to do this myself, and I'm going to do it anyway. Because you're giving so much time and energy to that noble goal in the face of that kind of opposition, I think it's worth taking a minute to make sure you are clear in your own mind and heart about what education is. And I want to suggest to you tonight, just by way of conversation, just so we can have something to chew on for the rest of the weekend, that if you understand education properly, you can do it in an hour. And that you ought to be about the business of doing it in an hour, every hour. I want to suggest to you what I mean by that tonight, and hopefully get a conversation going about it. But with that by way of introduction, let me give you a short history lesson on the subject of education. From its very beginnings until about 1750, American society held up theologians and ministers as its wisest men. Because of their education and knowledge of the spiritual world, they were the sages to whom we looked for guidance, comfort, and certainty. For the next 100 years or so, between 1750 and, say, 1860, between the American Revolution and the Civil War, Americans gave this position of reverence not to theologians, but primarily to lawyers and statesmen, whose education and knowledge of political philosophy guided the nation through its formative years. These are the years of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And then after that, throughout the late 19th century and up through World War I, it was another class of professionals who enjoyed this reputation above all others. It was college professors, believe it or not, who enjoyed this reputation above all other professions because of their knowledge and education in history and literature and economics and the theoretical sciences. Now, the century or so since World War I is really interesting. From 1920 to 2023. It's really interesting because I think it proves the adage, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because on the one hand, a completely different sort of wise man has come to command the unquestioned allegiance of our society. Research shows that it is not the minister anymore, who in this day and age may not even be professionally trained. It's also not the lawyer, whose ethics these days are often assumed to be suspect until enough evidence to the contrary can be presented. It's also not the college professor, who frequently has the reputation these days of the political radical. Instead, you probably know what I'm going to say. Instead, it's the physician today who speaks with inherent authority. Medical professionals whose distinguishing characteristic, think about this for a minute, is their detailed factual knowledge of the human body and its processes, are today's wise men. We trust them instinctively, not because of their spiritual insight, not because of their moral character, not because of their political ideas, but because of their education and knowledge of a particular element of nature. How times have changed. We wouldn't have looked at a 17th century theologian and said, "What do you know about nature? Tell me about how much you know about the natural world, and then I will trust you." Oh no, times have changed indeed. On the other hand, it is worth noting, and this is the point I want to make to you tonight, it's worth noting that we revere physicians today for precisely the same reasons that we revered ministers in the 17th century, and lawyer statesmen in the 18th century, and academics in the 19th century. It's because of their education in the disciplines most important to us. We consider them wise because they're educated, and we consider them educated because of their mastery of certain domains of knowledge. Right? That the physician holds the place of honor once reserved for the minister testifies perhaps to a shift towards the material world in our priorities, right? We're more interested in the physical processes as opposed to the theological sciences than we used to be. Maybe we're less concerned with the health of the soul than with the longevity of the body. However, this is not because the definition of wisdom has changed, or for that matter, the definition of education. The brain surgeon of 2023 enjoys the same reputation for wisdom as the Puritan preacher of 1630, and for the same reason. Education has made him the master of the knowledge his society cannot live without. Now, American schools of all kinds today enshrine these ideas of education and wisdom in their curriculum materials and in their pedagogy and their style of teaching and in their methodology. And all this is geared toward producing masters of various domains of knowledge. A doctor or an engineer or an artist or a scientist becomes a wise man, our schools claim, by going to school until he learns everything there is to know about a specialized field. And his mastery makes him wise. Not because such knowledge produces wisdom, listen, but because knowledge is synonymous with wisdom. Our schools thus define the terms of this discussion in very specific ways. The term education describes the acquisition or mastery of knowledge. The term wisdom describes the state of having acquired or mastered lots of it. And knowledge itself, which education assembles and which amounts to wisdom if enough of it has been assembled, describes a set of verifiable, factual data and useful, repeatable skills. And you might be thinking, yeah, so? You're not saying anything that isn't patently obvious and that I don't agree with. Well, I want to go to meddling as soon as I can. But when I lecture on this topic, I always ask parents and teachers directly whether they agree with these definitions. And most of them, to be fair, answer in the negative, at least in part. I have found, however, that direct inquiries rarely uncover an unexamined assumption, and that's what I want to talk about tonight, our unexamined assumptions about education. And so I want to ask you a rhetorical question instead, and it's the one I began the night with. If you had only 1 hour to give your student an education, what would you teach him? If you had only 1 hour to give your student an education, what would you teach him? The answers that I generally receive to this question fall into two broad categories for the most part. And the first category is the teach a man to fish category. The teach a man to fish category. Since 1 hour is insufficient time for any sort of comprehensive coverage, these teachers hope to give students the ability to achieve coverage on their own. Certain basic skills, they say, can function like stem cells, developing later in many directions and allowing for the eventual mastery of multiple domains of knowledge. This is the perspective that says you just teach them to read, write, and figure, and then give them a big stack of books and they complete the task on their own later, making the most of their limited 1 hour by giving them the stem cells of certain basic skills. Reading, writing, arithmetic, logic, and Latin have even been held up as sort of seminal disciplines that might function in this way. Now, I agree with many of the principles and the curriculum choices and the techniques that embody this perspective. Indeed, CenterForLit is aimed at just this sort of education. Give them the techniques that they can read any book with, and eventually you don't have to cover Hamlet in class today. You can teach him how to cover Hamlet on his own later on. The approach to reading and literature, in other words, that we espouse fits broadly into this category. But as an answer to my rhetorical question, it's an evasion. And it raises a couple of issues worth discussing. First of all, it ignores the literal meaning of the question. 1 hour is just as insufficient for teaching reading or writing or arithmetic or logic or any seminal skill as it is for teaching an entire subject. You can't teach a man to fish in a moment any more than you can feed him. But there's another assumption down here at the bottom of this answer that is problematic, and that is this: the assumption that the primary goal of education is mastery of skills and knowledge. If in a single hour the teacher cannot impart mastery itself, he must impart the tools by which mastery can be achieved. The rhetorical question introduces a problem of method, perhaps, but the teach a man to fish answer tackles it entirely from within the educational paradigm I've just been describing. Education is mastery. If you've only got an hour, get as close to mastery as you can in the hour. You can probably tell that I'm going to suggest something else altogether eventually as a definition for education. But let me give another rhetorical answer to this rhetorical question that I think we need to deal with. And it's another category of answer, and it's what I call the render unto Caesar category. We've got the teach a man to fish category, give him some seminal skills and let him finish the job on his own. Over here, we've got the render unto Caesar category. And these answers generally come from people of faith, like me, like many of us, who realize the impossibility of playing by the rules of this game, and so abandon the whole thing and reserve that entire precious hour for priority number one of any person of faith. I would teach him the one essential truth of religion, they say. Forget math, forget science, forget engineering, forget literature, I just teach him the one essential truth of religion. The assumption here, of course, is that the true knowledge of God is distinct from and superior to the knowledge of any human discipline, and that piety is more important than expertise. Now, this answer plays nicer with the rules of my experiment than the first one, since it is perhaps possible to communicate a single all-important religious principle in an hour. Indeed, I'm about to try it. However, this answer still works on the assumption that education is the mastery of a domain of knowledge outside the learner. In this case, it's a theological domain of knowledge rather than a mathematical or a grammatical one, but the pedagogy, the methods, the standards are identical. Discipline and practice to acquire mastery. That the teacher can reasonably hope to accomplish this goal in 1 hour is only because the goal itself is fairly simple and homogeneous. He can approach it with the same idea of education and of wisdom that's used in any university. All this answer is doing is shortening the list. Education involves learning one simple truth, mastering one simple truth. I'm going to give it to you, and I can do it in an hour, and the definitions that we assume about education and wisdom and mastery are all the same. Now, I'm going to say, before I blow this up as well as I can, that I agree with a lot of the elements of this approach. It is true, for example, that the knowledge of God belongs in a separate and a higher category in some ways than the knowledge of human disciplines. Furthermore, I agree that discipline and practice are indispensable aspects of any effective teaching, regardless of the subject. Can there be common ground, however, with mastery as the essential quality of an education and the kind of humility that the Apostle Paul uses when he says, if anyone knows anything, he doesn't know anything yet as he ought to know? Are we missing something important when we build our educational projects on the idea of mastery alone? Does this suggestion that mastery is perhaps not the center of the educational project cause you to question your own assumptions about education? When you sit down with your kids, are you aiming at mastery for them in any real sense? It's 1 Corinthians 8:2 that I quoted a moment ago, and I want to read it exactly so that we've got it in front of us. I want to suggest that this is the germ of the 1-hour lesson that might accomplish what I set out to accomplish in my rhetorical question with which I began this talk. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. One more time. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Here, my friends, is the educated mind in one glance. Paul understands that knowledge, that wisdom, comes from outside, and that the self-image of the truly educated person is suffused with humility. It is God alone who knows. The implication of that verse is that only God knows. And he does not know facts in this verse so much as he knows people. But if anyone loves God, Paul says, this one is known by him. The results of God's knowing us is that we are humble and able to express his love to those around us. And so this is the essential lesson. This is the thing we've got to find a way to inculcate and teach in our students in our every activity, whether it be math or reading or literature or science or physical education or auto mechanics or any other subject that we set out to teach them. How is it that we can make this essential lesson the center of everything we do? Because it sounds on the face of it, and I want to drive home this apparent inconsistency, it sounds on the face of it as if Paul is saying the quest for knowledge is futile, right? The quest for knowledge is self-contradictory, it's self-defeating. Don't even try it. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. I mean, a 21st century idiomatic translation of that verse might be, you don't know anything and you never will. And saying that acting like you know anything is just deceiving yourself. You're a complete and total ignoramus down to the bottom. You better hope God loves you. And that's maybe slightly overstated, but maybe not much. I think it's fair. I think it's what he might be saying. So how do we actually incorporate that idea, which I do think there's some truth to, that smells like the gospel just a little bit? How do we incorporate that into honest, disciplined effort at providing good education for our students? Well, I want to suggest a couple ideas. No matter which subject in the curriculum we turn to, there is a lesson at the heart of it that sounds a lot like the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians. And this is because the emergence of any new domain of knowledge, the emergence of nuclear physics, or the emergence of history as a discipline, or the emergence of astronomy, or the emergence of economics, or the emergence of grammar, or the emergence of painting, the emergence of any new domain of knowledge always begins, and if you look back in history, you can see this, it always begins with the thinkers in this discipline going, you know what, this is beyond me. I have no idea. I have no idea. I need to dig around and look because it appears to be inexplicable. In other words, the first moment in the development of any new domain of knowledge and any new discipline is a moment of profound self-awareness in ignorance. The guy who invented grammar, I don't know who that was. The guy who invented grammar first said, wow, people talk funny. I have no idea how this language can possibly be organized. The man who invented nuclear physics says, what in the world is going on down at the smallest levels? I have no literal idea. Faced with the undeniable sight of something beyond their ken, men say, in effect, I used to think I knew, but now I am drowned in ignorance. And that is the moment that true knowledge, true education emerges. We're going to talk about Job tomorrow night. And one of the things that happens in the story of Job is that Job fills his mouth with arguments, as he puts it, about who God is and how God behaves for like 41 chapters of the book of Job. And then God appears to Job and suggests in a couple of undeniable ways that he doesn't act and is not the way Job has assumed that he is and acts. And Job's response is to say, I used to think I knew what you were like, but now that I see you, I put my hand over my mouth and I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. And as I'm going to argue tomorrow, that is the first moment at which Job talks like an educated man. The first moment, the emergence, you might say, of a brand new domain of knowledge, Job's correct theological knowledge of God, begins in the moment when he says, oh no, I am completely overwhelmed by ignorance. I have been prattling on like a fool. I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. I've heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you and I'm undone. There is, this is a long way of saying, there is at the bottom of every discipline a detail like that, a lesson like that, a moment like that, where the student and the teacher together can say, we talked like we knew what we knew, but it turns out we don't know anything like we ought to know. And let us hope that God in his knowing can look down upon us in mercy. Let me give you some examples. Let's say that arithmetic is your favorite subject. And the question on the table is, how do I teach my kids arithmetic, teach my kids to master the techniques of arithmetic, but always keep in front of their minds this idea that true wisdom is found in humility, that true wisdom is in a knowledge of your ignorance. Well, what about this? Why is division by zero against the rules? I'm open to contributions. Why is division by zero against the rules? Why is it undefined, as they say in arithmetic? Do you know what the official answer is? We don't know. We don't know. It just has to be that way, or else arithmetic doesn't work. That is a very unsatisfactory answer. It actually amounts to an admission on the part of the mathematical establishment of the world of ignorance. We can't make it work if you can divide by zero, so you can't. Stop asking. Divide by 1. What if geometry is the subject you're interested in? You guys ever do the map coloring exercise? Here's a rhetorical question for you. Can you draw a map that needs more than 4 colors? Have you ever heard this before? Raise your hand. Am I alone in this one? You have? So here's the rule. You draw a map of an imaginary set of countries, an imaginary continent covered with countries, and you start coloring it according to this principle, according to this rule. Adjacent countries that touch each other, that share a border, have to be different colors. And the goal is to try and draw a map that requires more than 4 colors. And you can't do it. Right? Have you had this experience? Oh, great. So let's try it. Between now and tomorrow, I want you to go get a piece of paper, and I want you to draw an imaginary continent with countries in it of any shape you want, and color it with coloring crayons, or just imagine it, or use G for green and R for red, whatever. According to this rule, adjacent countries must be different colors. And try and make a map that requires more than 4. The reason you can't do that is that we don't know why. It just happens to be that way. Nobody made it up. It's just the way things are. How about language? What if languages are your favorite subject? Here's a question for you. Why are there, I love this question. Why are there 4 conjugations of Latin verbs? Wouldn't it have been easier if there was just the one? For goodness sakes. Why? Here's a great idea. I'm making up Latin, and I just put all the verbs in one conjugation. Give the poor kids a break. How about chemistry? By the way, what's the answer to that question? What's the answer to the question about Latin and conjugations and verbs? I don't know. What's the implication, though? What about language? What does it say about language? What does it say about grammar? What does it say about the rules of grammar and mastering those rules? When we codify a language, we simply try and make sense of something that has been given to us from the outside. We do not create. We just organize what was there before us, what is there outside of us. It does not come from within us, it comes from outside, and we try to make sense of it by wrapping our arms around it and putting it in the little buckets so that we can understand something that is a gift from beyond. Wisdom and knowledge don't come from in here, they come from out there. How about chemistry? What force holds the nucleus of the atom together? You guys know your junior high school level nuclear chemistry, right? The nucleus of the atom is composed of 2 types of particles. Does anybody know what they are? Protons and neutrons. That's exactly right. And neutrons have what electric charge? 0. And protons have what electric charge? Positive. And we know things about charges that positive charges always, like charges always repel each other. That's right. So if a nucleus is composed of very tightly smashed together positive charges, how is it that they're stuck together? Shouldn't they blow themselves apart, all being charged the same? Of course they should. Why don't they? Well, maybe it's because, as Paul says in Colossians, in Jesus Christ, all things hold together. And that's as close as we can come. That's it. That's going to have to suffice for an answer. Because whatever the reason is, it's out there. You can't make it up. I love this one. What if astronomy is your bag? What if you want to talk to your kids about astronomy? This is going to be hard to get through without laughing. Why does the moon appear bigger on the horizon? You've noticed that it does, right? At moonrise, the moon is huge, right? On a clear day, at a full moon. And then 2 hours later, when it's a third of the way up the sky or halfway up the sky, it's half the size, right? Does the moon shrink? No. Does it get farther away? No. So what's the reason? You know what the scientific community says? You can look this up. There's a thing called Wikipedia. You can look it up. You know what they say? I swear to you, they say we don't know. Today, in 2023, nobody knows. Do you know, it's an optical illusion. That's all they can say. It's an optical illusion. We don't know why. Have you ever verified that this is an optical illusion in the one verifiable way there is to verify this? I'm going to get in trouble with my wife. You can stand with your feet wide apart and bend over at the I'm not going to do it. Bend over at the waist and look at the moon upside down between your legs. And it will not be bigger on the horizon. If your head is upside down when looking at the horizon moon, it will not be bigger. It will be the same size as it is high up the sky. How do I know this? Because I am an inquisitive person, and I have verified it. It's an optical illusion. That much I know, because I have verified that it's an optical illusion. Why? Nobody knows. Okay, let's get more serious. By the way, what do these things tell us about reality? What do these things tell us about education, about mastery, about wisdom? What should these things engender in the mind, even while we're having a laugh at our own expense? A sense should be growing in our hearts that we are visitors, that we are not masters of anything, that we are creatures who receive anything we have by the way of knowledge from without. And we receive an incomplete set of details at that. Let's talk about the humanities a little bit. Let's talk about art. Anybody familiar with the paintings of Jackson Pollock? Yes? Raise your hand. The National Gallery of Art, big 12-foot canvas. It looks like somebody stood across the room and slung paint at it, because in fact, that's exactly what he did. Slung paint at it from across the room. Raise your hand if you know Rembrandt, the 17th century Dutch master. Okay. Which paintings are more beautiful? Pollock's or Rembrandt's? Raise your hand if you say Rembrandt's. Raise your hand if you say Pollock's. That's interesting. It's very interesting. What does this vote? You guys saw, right? It was like 100 to none. What does this vote tell us about? About what condition does this vote testify? Does it testify to the definition of beauty? Or does it testify to our collective ignorance of modernist painting? Just asking. If there were one expert in modernist painting here who said Rembrandt's are more beautiful than Pollock's, that person's vote would carry a lot more weight. If we had half and half, if we had the room divided in half between Rembrandt lovers and American modernists, that would be an interesting vote to take. But even then, my friends, even then, the question of what is beauty would be beyond us. And we'd have to say, with all of our collected wisdom, there's just no way to know. There's no definition of beauty that we can all agree on. It's out there somewhere. How about philosophy? Is it better to receive an injury or to give one? Depends on the situation, right? How about economics? By the way, you don't know. It's too big a question for just a person, isn't it? There was no answer when Aristotle asked it either. How about economics? You guys ever read the Leonard Read pamphlet, I, Pencil? Anybody know that? How is a pencil made? Anybody know how you make a pencil? Does anybody know how many people it takes to make a pencil? A pencil. Little Ticonderoga pencil with a pink eraser and a yellow paint and a little lead. Legions. It takes legions of people to make a pencil. Spread out all over the world. There is no possible way that one man could conceive of making a pencil. By the way, I highly recommend reading the Leonard Read pamphlet, I, Pencil. Wrote it in the 50s, I think. Worked for the Foundation of Economic Education, and it was a wonderful explanation of how the free market works. But for my purposes, what it does is illustrate in a profound way how little we have in the way of mastery of anything. We might be able to understand how a pencil is made, especially after reading Read's pamphlet, but none of us could do it. How about history? This will be my last one, and then I want to make some comments about these observations. Why did the American Civil War happen? I mean, it happened. We have newspaper reports and accounts and some photographs, and we're pretty sure it happened. But why? How would you answer that honestly? If you were trying to save your own skin in a discussion environment where your professor was on your case, why did the American Civil War happen? How would you defend yourself? What would you say? It's too broad a question, right? It's too broad a question. There were lots of causes. Yeah, and we can't have all the detail. We don't know exactly why it happened because we were in the minds of the people that were the primary actors. And then you'd be on to something, because think about it for a minute. How much do you know? No, let me put the question to you this way. How many things happened in this room today? How many things happened in this room today? What fraction of those things do you know about? Let me broaden it for you, because maybe you weren't in this room today, in which case your answer would be none. How many things happened in this building today? Here we are, a couple of hundred of us having a convention, going back and forth between tables, talking and conversing and thinking. How many different things happened here today in this building? Many. What percentage of them do you have firsthand knowledge of? Give me a number. What percentage of the things that happened in this building today do you have firsthand knowledge of? 22%. Oh, I was going to say, wow, you are a smart dude. 0.2%, he says. That might even be generous. Now, let's expand it a little bit. Spokane today. Oh, it's approaching zero now, right? In terms of the percentage of things you... And let's not say first-hand knowledge, let's say second-hand knowledge. Any knowledge. Documentary evidence of. Maybe we get up to 1% in Spokane. Let's expand it. The United States today. Obviously, our knowledge of what's going on in the world quickly approaches zero. Now, back it up 200 years. What do you know about the American Civil War? You know nothing. You know nothing about the American Civil War. Back it up another 100 years. What do you know about the Revolution? Oh my goodness, what do you know about the Norman Conquest? What do you know about the Viking invasions? Next to nothing. What can you possibly know about history? Leave off the pursuit of mastery. It is a fool's errand. It is a pipe dream. And yet, this kind of thinking can help us a long way towards the idea of a 1-hour education that I suggested at the beginning of this talk. Because they suggest, among other things, that the rules exist outside of us, outside of the student. And there are rules that cannot be broken. They bind us and constrain us. They are what they are. Even when men invent rules, as by making division by zero illegal or by grouping verbs into conjugations, they do not create. They merely assent to what they have discovered and attempt to organize what already exists. Questions like these emphasize that human explanations, as of subnuclear forces that hold the atom together or optical illusions about the moon, are provisional at best, and that human discoveries reduce by only a tiny fraction the vast total of what we do not and never will understand. These questions overwhelm the would-be expert with the impossibility of comprehensive knowledge. For how can he know anything about the distant past, American Civil War, American Revolution, Viking invasions, if he can't know even a fraction of what went on in Valley Assembly on April 21st, 2023? And finally, these questions confront the naivete of his instincts, his native instincts, when he says a Rembrandt is prettier than a Pollock. And they help him to question whether he is a reliable judge of good and evil, because he just might not be. I I think this is the first step on a road to a real education, on the road to a moment in a student's life when he says with Job, "Behold, I have spoken about what I did not understand, things too lofty for me that I did not know." And Job says it in reference to God, but it could easily be said in reference to the world of human knowledge as well. "I've heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees your vastness, and I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes." This is the essence and the beginning and the first step of a real education. And this is the kind of thing that I think we should be inculcating into our students. Now, the question will arise, well, how can we do this while still helping them pass their SAT? Which, of course, is one of the main reasons that we've got them in class to begin with. Because we want them to be successful in life and to get a good job and maybe even qualify for a college that will give them a good education. And you got to have some level of some kind of mastery. But I want to suggest that in the presence of this kind of foundational humility, none of the mastery that a student acquires will ruin him. But without it, it can only ruin him. Without this kind of humility down at the base of his soul, his every acquisition of knowledge is going to puff him up even more. And it's going to make him a younger version of me, the fastest man in the world at taking credit for the knowledge that I have and making an equation in my head and in my heart between Andrews and God. It's an impulse in our flesh from the moment that we come into this world, and our parents are our best hope at getting rid of it. Our parents are the ones who are on the scene day in and day out, who can say to us, "Let us consider, Johnny, the moon on the horizon." I want you to stand with your feet far apart. Bend at the waist, if you would, please. And I want to ask you a question. Why is it small now, smarty pants? I have no idea if I have any time left, but I want to do this. I want to read in all seriousness one more time the Apostle Paul's reminder from 1 Corinthians. And I want to suggest that this is the bedrock. I mentioned in a talk I gave this afternoon that the bedrock of true Christian reading, a Christian literary theory, comes from the Epistle of James, where the author says, "Let every man be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to wrath." And I suggested that this single line from the New Testament gives us all the critical theory in literature and reading comprehension that we need. I want to suggest that this line from the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians is the bedrock and the heart and the soul of real education and real wisdom, because it is the soul of true humility. And if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Lord, I pray for my brothers and sisters in this room tonight that you would know them, that you would direct your knowledge of them in their persons, at their hearts by faith from your throne in heaven, that you would make them humble mothers and fathers, that you give them the ability to communicate this lesson of humility in the heart to their students, and that all the work they do at helping their students to mastery of various human domains would be protected and contextualized properly in this world of humility before your love. In Jesus' name I pray it. Amen.